Hello, and welcome back to Organic Gardening for Beginners. My name is Jessica, the host of the show, and in case this is your first episode or you've listened for a few weeks and I haven't yet introduced myself, I am in Oregon, Zone 8 in the Willamette Valley specifically, so lots and lots of rain, nice hot summers. And we are apparently frost-free, it would seem. It's been a couple weeks. If you hear my dog barking in the background, I apologize for that. It's a real-life episode today. We have been enjoying some nice spring weather. It's awesome. Most of the garden is planted out. There are, of course, those stragglers that keep looking at me every time I walk past them and I water them and they need to get in the ground. My husband keeps giving me crap about don't buy any more plants until the ones I already have are planted, but I think we all know how that goes. Just one more. Alrighty, so today we are talking about companion planting in containers. This is another listener request. I did one last week about growing in the shade via an email that I got. And so today we're talking about containers. I know that so many of us have limited garden space. I was in that position for a very long time, renting or living in, small houses, small yards where you just don't have a whole lot of garden space, or maybe your life is just too chaotic. You've got all the space in the world, but there's way too much going on and you just want a few planters or for a few pots up on your patio, backyard where it's easy to access, easy to harvest, water, take care of, all that good stuff. And so containers can really be an awesome tool to use that I feel like sometimes are in a world of their own. And blending them can actually be an awesome way with an in-ground garden, raised beds, whatever it is. So a great tool. So we're going to talk about a few tips to keep your containers going, no matter if you're doing just one plant in that pot or you are using companion planting, as well as some combinations that I think work really well, either because I've done them myself or just based on, growth habits and how the plants get along that I think would make handy little combinations. So 2 things to start us off. If companion planting is totally new to you, I talk about it very, very frequently on the show. And it is the practice of putting together more than one plant so that they can benefit each other, or more than one type of plant. So not just like 3 tomato plants, but 3 different types of plants. And there are all kinds of rules that you can find of plant this with that and don't plant this with that. I don't subscribe to those necessarily. What my method is more along the lines of everybody gets along, the more the merrier. You can use complementary growth habits to make the most of your space. The more flowers you put in with your veggies, the better, because it helps with pollination and pest management, sometimes even disease management. And if I'm going out to pick a bouquet, then I want to pick for my lunch as well and not have to visit different gardens. And I just honestly think it looks really pretty. So I use companion planting all the time. Lots of episodes about it. If I remember, I'll link a few in the show notes so that you can go back and kind of get a better rundown of what it is and how to do it. And then for container planting, obviously I'm talking anything from a little itty bitty pot to maybe a hanging basket to your standard like big resin pots, or heck, you could even be talking about a 5-gallon bucket that you put a few plants in. Don't forget your drainage holes, and that can be considered a container garden as well. So do as if you were in ground as far as planting in a container in general. Keep it well watered. Try to have good soil. Choose complementary plants, so not a whole bunch of climbers, but rather ones that will fill out the different levels of growing zones, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. You need to pay attention to your plant spacing so that everybody's got enough room, and keep them well watered throughout the summer. I think that's really the biggest difference with growing in the ground, is that your containers are probably going to dry out more quickly, or rather your plants only have the dirt that you give them, the soil that you give them. Whereas an in-ground garden, the plant can mine for water and nutrients for that matter with new roots that they either send down or out or closer to the surface, wherever they're finding the water and minerals that they need. Whereas in a container, they've got what they've got. So if you give them 2 gallons of soil, that's what they have. So make sure you keep it watered. That might mean every single day in the dead of summer. That might mean once a week in the early spring or in the fall. Totally depends on what you plant, what kind of soil you have, how big the pot is, what the weather's doing, all those things. So I can't really tell you do this Exactly. Just stick your finger in the dirt. If it's really dry, water it right now. If it's really soggy, leave it alone. If it's somewhere in the middle, then use common sense, really. That's all it goes down to. And a few no-goes for containers are really large plants that just probably aren't going to do well, and you're kind of going to set yourself up for failure. So I'm thinking of things like corn or mammoth sunflowers, really large plants like tomatillos. You can do a tomatillo in a pot. I've done it before, but those things get massive. And it just, to me, it's not worth it. I prefer those in ground, or if I'm super duper limited on space, I just don't grow them and I pick up a few here and there from the farmer's market. But other than that, even tomatoes you can grow in containers. You can grow pretty much every herb, even rosemary. And so you are not limited by and large of what you can grow in containers. A lot of container gardens, I think, focus on flowers, or you think of like a hanging basket, those big, massive ones that you probably just saw for Mother's Day. And there's a little slogan or a rule that goes along with them called a thriller, a filler, and a spiller. And what that means is having something tall in the middle or towards the back of the pot, having something to fill out that middle space, kind of, your medium-sized plants. And then a spiller is something that goes over the edge and drapes gracefully and beautifully and, makes it look pretty. You can follow that rule whether you're planting with just veggies or just flowers, just herbs, or any combination. And I kind of kept that in mind with the examples that I'm going to give in the second half of the show of how can you use all layers of the pot or the container, up vertically just a little bit, that middle zone, and draping over the edge, because it's your best way to use space. And unless you have an unlimited supply of containers, then you probably want to use every little scrap that you've got. So as I mentioned, start with good soil mix in your containers. I'm sorry, guys, my voice keeps going so scratchy today. I don't know why. I keep pausing to clear it, but I'm just going to roll with it. So rookie mistake number one is just putting plain garden soil in your containers. And the reason you don't want to do that is because it tends to compact, because that soil is meant to be out loose in the garden with lots of worms and bugs and plant roots to aerate it and mix it all around. And so if you just put that in your container, then chances are it's going to become this brick by the end of the season. And so instead, you can use some garden soil, like don't totally discount it, but instead what you can do is make a more appropriate mix for your containers, such as choosing your bulk filler like coco coir or peat moss, something to help keep it light and aerated, such as perlite. I also use vermiculite in all of my planting mixes, whether it's for seed starting or containers, and vermiculite helps retain some moisture. And then you obviously need some sort of fertilizer or organic matter, which I use compost. You can use worm castings. You can use homemade compost. You might use your garden soil for part of this. I actually did an episode called, what was it? Super simple guide to soil or something like that a few episodes ago. I'll link it in the show notes, where I gave a few recipes in the episode and then I wrote them in those show notes as well. So I'll link that if you want exact ratios, but I kind of go by feel. And so I will do, say we'll just use a 5-gallon bucket for a ratio example. I would do probably half of that with the coco coir or peat moss. I tend to use coco coir these days, not necessarily because of the argument for and against mining peat moss versus traveling the coco coir halfway around the world, but because I just prefer it. The stuff from the store these days is so full of rocks and sticks that it's a total pain in the butt. It dries out a lot. I've noticed when it forms this like crust on the soil surface, which really bugs me. And so I lean a lot more heavily towards coco coir these days. So about half of your 5-gallon bucket with that. And then I would say at least another quarter with your compost mix, whether that's worm castings, a bag of chicken manure, or garden compost, or, like I said, your compost. And then that last quarter, I would do mostly perlite, a dash of vermiculite. And then if you're not sure of the quality of your compost, toss in a handful of just a granulated organic all-purpose fertilizer. I really like Dr. Earth and Down to Earth brands. Those ones are great ones for me. Mix it all together, use that to fill your bucket. So that's obviously a very rough ratio. And eventually you kind of get a feel for it of this is too fluffy. It doesn't feel like it's dense enough or has enough nutrition, or man, this is really dense and I'm nervous that it's going to get compacted. And so you can kind of adjust your ratios a little bit. Some people throw sand in there instead of perlite, and that helps with the drainage. So use your materials, figure out, what you can source either cheaply and or free, or, is just readily available to your doorstep where you don't have to haul a bunch of materials in. And then one thing to add on is make sure you mulch. Even in containers, it makes a huge, huge difference. You can use straw. I find that really clumsy because it's, these long pieces of grass that you're trying to fit into a round pot. I prefer wood chips. Even in my garden, like in-ground garden, I prefer wood chips because they're just handy to me and I can get them for free. Use your grass clippings, use some cardboard if that's what you've got, but it's going to help keep down weeds. It'll help keep in moisture, and it will help prevent that crust from forming that I mentioned before, especially if you've got a peat-based potting soil. Okay, so you might want to put your container on a saucer so that it catches the water. Don't let it sit in the water for forever. Water your pot. It's going to drain out the bottom. That water will soak back in through the capillary action into the soil. And then when you remember to, I would say in half an hour, but let's be honest, it's going to be when you remember it, drain out the saucer just so that it's not sitting in water for too long, because most plants don't care for that. And then a couple other tips to take advantage of that thriller category, the tall thing in the middle or the back of your pot. Tomato cages can be really handy. I don't always use them for tomatoes because typically the tomatoes get too big and they just dwarf the cage. So I tend to use them more for things like cucumbers or even zucchini sometimes. Snap peas, peppers. I love putting peppers in tomato cages. There are cages that you can get that are much sturdier and are way more appropriate for a big indeterminate tomato like a sun gold or, other type of slicing tomato. You can grow nasturtiums up them, sweet peas, all kinds of things. Anything that needs support, really. Black-eyed Susan vine, all kinds of stuff. You can obviously just put a big post in the middle that you stake your plants to. Maybe you're growing some cosmos and the cosmos are going to grow up pretty tall as this big bushy plant. And so you can put that stake in the middle at the time of planting and then kind of lasso some twine around the cosmos plant as it gets big so that it's not necessarily tied to the stake, but just supported by the stake. I hope that makes sense. So you can get kind of creative with the support that you use. There are all kinds of trellises you can buy, like little redwood grids that you can stick in the pot that make it easy for not so traditionally climbing things like nasturtiums to you can kind of weave their vines in between those grid spaces. Put a branch in there. I've done that too. I've gotten some branch trimmings for my snap peas before. Get creative. Think of what you have already laying around or what you can easily get. And that will work for a vertical support. And then lastly, plant herbs in all of your empty spaces in your pots, because chances are they're going to squeeze in there just fine and make an additional planting that you might have thought, I don't have room for that. So things like oregano are really nice little ground covers. They make a nice little, usually a mounding growth habit. Some of them tend to creep more than others. It depends on which type you get. Basil can get tall, but if you just kind of squish it in between your plants, then it'll stay a little bit smaller because it's competing for light and water. Chives, I put chives everywhere, or green onions. They're not technically an herb, but kind of the same idea of just, hey, I've got this little empty spot in the pot. I'm going to stick some chives in there. And even if you never harvest from them, if you've already got chives or, you don't love them or whatever, they still make a really beautiful purple flower that the bees love. And the birds will come eventually and eat the seeds. So I love to stick chives wherever there's room. I am thinking those are the tips I've got for growing in a container, no matter what sort of combination you're doing, or, like I said before, this pot is only for cucumbers and that's it. Whatever your setup is, those tips are going to apply to your containers no matter what. Now, for combinations, I thought of 10 for you to kind of give you a jumping off point. There is no hard and fast rule of how to use companion planting in your containers, which I'm pretty sure I already mentioned. Think of how to use your space. Think of what growing conditions each of these plants needs. If you've got something that really doesn't want a whole lot of fertilizer, maybe kind of average soil like a cosmos, where the richer soil it has, the more leaf growth it does and fewer flowers, then maybe don't put that with something that does need that regular moisture, that does need that regular fertilizer, or rich soil, I should say. I don't want you feeling like you have to dump fertilizer on your plants every week, because that's usually not the case. Of something like a cucumber or cilantro enjoys water. It doesn't need a whole lot of fertilizer, but it does need regular water, especially as it starts to get warmer. So think about your compatibility there. And if you aren't sure, or you want to see how much you can push it, totally experiment, see what happens. If one of your plants is really struggling, then pull it out, stick it in a different pot, cut it down, toss it in the compost, and put something else in there. One of the things I've really been trying to tell myself this year, and I already know this, but we all need reminders of things, is just get it done. Planted is better than perfect. We are still very much building up our property. We moved here not quite a year ago yet, and we have been busy little beavers putting in garden space and orchards and getting animals and, the house and just all the stuff. And as I mentioned at the start of the show, I still have all these flats of plants sitting around that need to get in the ground. And it's so easy, even with 20 plus years in the garden, to be waiting for that perfect, I want to put this bed here, so I'm going to hold on to these plants so I can make the bed first and then put them in. Or I'm waiting for, whatever the scenario is. And sometimes you're going to be waiting for forever, or at the very least until next season. And so just like these containers or any other garden, this is kind of a side note, just get it in the ground. It just needs to grow. Put it in the dirt. Let it do its thing. If it's not what you had in mind originally, oh well. I could do a whole episode based off of how much my plans have changed from the start of the season to where I'm at today, because my somewhat unrealistic plans back in January, February are not what's happening now. And some things are better and some things I'm disappointed didn't work out, but that's life in general. And that's certainly life in the garden. So moral of the story here is just put it in your container. Even if it's a salvia that can do well with dry soil and you're putting it next to lettuce that wants regular water, just throw those things in and let them grow, do their thing. Chances are everything's going to be totally fine. Anyways, back to my 10 combinations. So my most classic example is tomatoes, basil, and marigolds. These guys will grow very well together. They are some of the most classic companion planters or companion planting plants out there, such as basil, reputedly improves the flavor of tomatoes. Marigolds are scientifically proven to help with pest and disease management. So throw those suckers all together and you have a very nice looking pot. So put your tomato in the middle with one of those sturdy cages, or towards the back if your container is against a wall or a fence, something like that, put it in the back. And then ring the outside with the basil and marigolds. You can alternate them. You can do, one half of the pot with basil, one half with marigold. Doesn't matter at all. Just include them both. And then you've got edibles in all of the plants. Marigolds are edible. They don't taste that great, in my opinion, but you can eat them or, use them as a garnish. And then you've got your flowers for your pollinators, your beneficial insect attractant, and all that good stuff. Awesome beginner companion planted container to try this year if it's totally new to you. Next up, I have peppers, green onions, and zinnias. And pepper, again, I would put in the middle of the pot, put a tomato cage around it or some sort of a stake, because chances are it's going to need a little bit of support once it gets really heavy with fruit. Your zinnias, I would put a couple in that pot to grow up and around the pepper. And then the green onion, just kind of poke in wherever there's room. If you don't like onions or don't want to grow green onions or whatever, you can swap that out for just about anything. You can put in cilantro, parsley, thyme. If you do thyme, I would put it towards the edge because it grows low. It's not as tall as the peppers or zinnias, and you're going to want it to have that exposure to the sunlight at the edge of the pot as opposed to getting swallowed up by the zinnia or pepper. And if you don't want an herb and you just want another flower, then either pack in more zinnias or choose, honestly, pretty much any other flower. You could do marigolds again. You could do calendula. A dwarf cosmos would work. Just give it space from the pepper in the middle of the pot. Next one is a bush or dwarf cucumber on a tomato cage, or you can let it kind of spill out a little bit, a nasturtium and a cilantro. And the cilantro is going to benefit from some of the shade provided by the cucumber, especially if you put it on a tomato cage or one of those little grid trellises we talked about, because cilantro doesn't love hot weather and it will start to bolt when the sun really comes out consistently. And your nasturtium, if you're growing that dwarf cucumber up the cage or trellis, then the nasturtium is going to either spill out over the edge of the pot, or it might send a few shoots out, or not shoots, but vines that make their way up the trellis as well. So you've got a nice use of all of your climbing layers as well as your draping layers, and then that middle layer kind of taken up by your cilantro. Again, if you don't love cilantro, if it tastes like soap to you, feel free to substitute it with a different herb, a different medium-sized flower, maybe something like a salvia or a scabiosa would be beautiful in there, so that you have that flower. The next example, what is this? I think this is number 4 on my list, is a pole bean in growing up a teepee, salvia or marigolds, and then some sort of lower grower like lettuce or even a radish. Marigolds are known to help with flea beetles on your beans. And for the pole beans, it's important that you grow them up, whether it's a teepee type of trellis or a grid or even a tomato cage could work in this case, but you got to grow those suckers up. Otherwise, you got to put in a bush bean, because pole beans left to just grow and sprawl are not going to perform very well for you, and they will smother everything around them as they look for something to grab onto. So they don't perform well. The radish is going to take up the lower growing zone in the pot itself. And if you don't love radish, then lettuce will grow at about the same height that the radish greens would have. So they take up that same layer. Next up, we've got cosmos, kale, and alyssum. And cosmos, depending on which variety you grow, can be either pretty tall at like 5 feet tall, or you can get dwarf varieties such as, what's the name? It's the orange and yellow one. I forget now what it's called, but you would recognize it as soon as you see it. And those ones tend to stay on the shorter side, like more like the 3 feet size. There's also rubinato, which is a really pretty deep cranberry color, but it maxes out at also about 3 feet. So these guys are much more manageable in a container. I've grown standard varieties in a container as well that in the ground would get up to 5 feet, but they do stay shorter when their roots are more contained. And then the kale will also get a couple feet high. So I would perhaps put the cosmos in the middle, a couple of kales on the outside, and then alyssum I would put around the edges to kind of creep out across the soil surface and again drape over the edge of the pot. That one's going to be awesome for beneficials. If you are worried about aphids on your kale, your ladybugs are going to come in on the alyssum for sure. You will get bees and butterflies on your cosmos. So less veggie production, more flowers, but hey, it totally works. You can also do a tomato planter with tomatoes, basil, and oregano. If you're not into marigolds, some people don't like the scent of them. Use your tomato in the middle, your basil around the outside, and then put a couple of oreganos in there. And as I mentioned with one of the other combos, oregano is going to ground cover a little bit and potentially even drape over the side of your planters. And you've got some tomato sauce ready to go in that planter. I always love the themed gardens like the salsa garden and the pizza garden and all that good stuff. It's always a fun way to put together a container. Speaking of which, this one's like a salad garden here, is kale, spinach, and strawberries. Strawberries are going to go on the outside of the planter. They're going to drape over, send out runners, make fruit on all those stems that they're sending over the edge. You can put your kale in the middle since it's going to get the tallest, and then a ring of spinach or even just a few a few plants around the outside with your spinach, and you've got a nice salad ready to go. Your kale is going to last the longest of the two. Your basil will eventually bolt as it gets hot. The kale will make it through the heat of summer and even the cold of winter, no problem. So you can plan on having that one for at least a year, like an actual 12-month period. And your strawberries will last as well because they are going to send out those runners to propagate themselves throughout the seasons. And then next up, we've got snap peas on some sort of cage or trellis, or like I mentioned, get a dwarf variety and put a couple of branches in the pot for them to climb up. And then parsley or other herb, you could put chives in here too, just to take up that middle zone. And then beets to take care of a root crop that uses the actual soil itself as its main growing zone. You're going to get the beet greens off of there, parsley. You can make a really nice salad out of those too. Steam up the beets, put a little olive oil or avocado oil and balsamic vinegar, sprinkle some parsley on there, some feta. Delicious. And then your snap peas will do just fine on that cage. All right, last one is a dwarf sunflower. Important to do dwarf here so that it doesn't get crazy tall. In the middle or the back of your planter, calendula and lettuce taking up that kind of middle and lower zones. Everything's edible here. Sunflower petals are edible. Again, they don't taste like much to me, but you can totally eat them and they're fun for kids to eat. The calendula, the whole plant's edible, but the flowers themselves are very medicinal for things like salves and balms. The calendula plant is good for inflammation and skin damage and like cuts and stuff like that. And then, of course, your lettuce is super handy for salads. Very low maintenance. Everything here requires kind of the same amount of water, same soil type. And because the sunflowers are dwarf and they don't get as tall, they can handle a little bit more shade than some of your taller sunflowers. So this is a good combination if you are in a little bit of a shadier area. As I'm looking at my list, I would say the kale, spinach, and strawberries would also be good for shadier gardens. You could certainly try the bush cucumber or the dwarf cucumber, nasturtium and cilantro combo in a little bit more shade. The ones with tomatoes, try to get them as much sun as possible. The kale, cosmos, and alyssum, you could even push it with a little bit of shade. I've grown cosmos in shade before and they've done just fine. Not as many flowers as in full sun, but still nothing to where you would say, you know, it's not worth growing this cosmos just because it's in the shade. So hope that makes sense. That's it for today. Lots of ideas. Get out there, get your hands dirty. It's so much fun out there right now. This season is amazing. It's so nice to have come out of a Pacific Northwest winter that we haven't experienced in a very long time with so much rain and so many gray skies. And now we get to wake up to the sunshine and the birds every morning, and it is amazing. And every morning I go outside and I milk my sheep, which just adds another layer of fun to the morning. Talk to you guys next week. Bye.